Emelia Perez is the film that begs to ask the question, what would happen if a cartel boss has a sex change? Manitas Del Monte is a violent Mexican cartel boss who approaches a lawyer named Rita Moracosto to ask for help with changing his gender so that he can evade police. And after seeing just how corrupt the legal system is, Rita decides to give it a go and finally get something for herself. So she travels the world looking for surgeons to do the procedure and eventually finds the perfect surgeon in Israel. But once she does, she's blindsided by the fact that not only is he leaving behind his balls, but also his wife and kids. But they go ahead with the procedure, and Manitas Del Monte turns into the very beautiful Emilia Perez. Disguising herself as Manitas' long-lost sister, she decides to take in her wife and children. But soon, Emilia learns that her ex-wife has already moved on to another cartel boss, Gustavo, who I'll say is much better looking. She also learns that before Manitas disappeared, she was actually having an affair with the same man. So Emilia, in her machismo-induced rage, decides to send goons after Gustavo and tells him to kick it, get out of town, and never come back. But Gustavo does not agree. In fact, he retaliates by taking her captive and holding her for ransom. Rita, who by this point in the film is almost completely forgotten about, goes to rescue Emilia, and during a shootout, that's when Emilia gets shot and reveals to her ex-wife that she is actually Manitas Del Monte. Now, that was the entire plot of Emilia Perez, and if it sounded a little bit like a telenovela, well, that's because initially it was going to be a telenovela before it was turned into an opera, I guess, is what this was supposed to be. This was a film about Mexico that was filmed in France, directed by a French guy who was incredibly dismissive to criticisms from Mexicans about the authenticity of the film, specifically its spotty and geographically inaccurate use of Spanish. A lot of Mexicans were not a fan of its portrayal of drug cartels, and especially the fact that it apparently only stars one Mexican person. But as a transgender woman and a former thespian, I had a lot of commentary about the film's representation and its specific take on the movie musical. But I am getting ahead of myself as per usual. Hi, my name is katblaque, and I like to think that I make content for introspective hot people. And if you're here, I'll assume that's you. Welcome to my closet where we watch films that reflect culture. And if you like what you see, be sure to click my button and come up and see me sometime. Now, when I first heard about this film, it was through the song La Vaginoplastia, which for me just came off as an incredibly poorly written song that I couldn't even imagine a transgender person had any involvement with, purely because the way they were talking about it just seemed so divorced, at least to me, from the way that a lot of people would talk about trans bodies if they were thoughtful about trans bodies. So I went into this film kind of immediately recognizing that it wouldn't really be great trans representation. But I will say one of the most interesting aspects of this film is that Carla Sofia Gascon is a transgender woman, and she stars in this film. And in so many ways, this portrayal is unique because we actually get to see an example of a transgender actress deciding to essentially detransition for her role. And when asked about this, Carla said that she couldn't imagine someone else playing the role that she was playing because she felt that that would fracture her relationship with playing this character. And I understood that, and it was such a great example of the fact that there are trans actors who are willing to do this. One of the standard excuses people give for not wanting to hire trans actors for trans roles is that they're unwilling to do that. Now, I think that there's a conversation to be had about why so many narratives that include transgender people require the transition story. I especially feel that way as somebody who transitioned as a teenager and is in their mid-30s. It's weird to me that people would want to think about how I was as a teenager to talk about what I'm doing in my 30s. But either way, it's very, very interesting that this happened in the film and that this is actually a film starring an actual transgender person who did actually go through a lot of the uncomfortable things that a lot of people would assume trans actors do not want to go through. Now, that all being said, to me, that really was the best aspect of the trans representation. And frankly, a lot of the stuff that I did look at in the film and say, oh, that's accurate. It's cool that they understand that. Those are all things that actually came into the film because of Carla's input into the character of Emelia Perez. Apparently in the original script, it was a pretty straightforward story about a cartel boss who transitions to evade police. But with working with Carla, the director got to know a bit more about living with gender dysphoria, and Manitas' transition went from being a ruse to a very genuine thing that they were doing as a response to gender dysphoria. And it's very, very common for people who are dysphoric to lean into aspects of hypermasculinity before they transition. I have actually dated a lot of people who would later come out as trans women. Now, not to make this too much about me, but I date men who like to be men. Well, we'll just put it that way. So a lot of the men who turned out not to be that I've dated were the kind of dudes that you would not necessarily suspect of being transgender. And in that way, I think that would have been a really interesting thing to pull from. But a lot of what she inputted into this film, it's kind of just like in the script, not necessarily in the overall plot, if that makes any sense. It's like they made some fixes in some spots, but left some things in other spots. Jacques Audiard, who is the director of this film, is, I guess, good in other contexts, but to me it was very obvious from a lot of this movie that he was very unfamiliar with transgender experiences, purely because I think there were so many more interesting things that could have been said with a full and honest, good faith understanding of who transgender women are. Because personally to me, maybe this is unpopular, but I don't necessarily hate the premise, right? I don't necessarily hate the premise of a drug cartel boss really being a transgender woman and wanting to escape her life from violence and the hypermasculinity that she would lean into because she's trying to hide herself, and starting a new life. I don't hate that idea. But what I did sort of hate is the fact that so much of this film is kind of written from the perspective of a man. A lot of the anxieties in the film are the anxieties that a man would have. You could even argue that this film is really about the idea that even if you change, there are some things about you that will never change. And in this film, male ego, machismo, masculinity are things that linger beneath the surface of Emelia Perez. And there are aspects of this film, I think, that really don't quite make sense with some of Carla's input, purely because the narrative seems to really be about a man pretending to be a woman, not genuinely a transgender woman. For example, when she reconnects with her family, Emilia has this almost like hormone-induced response to her ex-wife because she's attracted to her. And there's this sort of suggestion by the way that Emelia Perez is interacting with her ex-wife that there's something central and male about her that she cannot control. This is a character who is supposed to canonically have undergone bottom surgery. By the time they reconnect, it's been 4 years. One of the common responses to both HRT and also bottom surgery is a pretty severe decrease in your sex drive, to the point where there are some transgender women who are post-op who do actually end up taking testosterone in order to still experience a bit of a sex drive. Now, of course, cis women can be lecherous, trans women can be lecherous. That's all very true, right? Anyone of any gender can be lecherous, right? But The way it's kind of presented in the film is as though she couldn't help herself. In this film, Emelia Perez's testosterone is sort of seen as this thing that never quite goes away. And this is also something that comes up when she starts to get close to her children, who only recognize her through the way that she smells. There's a song that the children sing that's about how the manitas that they used to know used to be a dirty man, a man who was rough around the edges and smelled like gasoline and dirt, essentially. And apparently, when they interact with Emelia Perez, they still smell that same smell. Now, another interesting thing that happens when you're on HRT is it does change the way that your body smells, to the point where I would say that there have been times in my life where I could tell that I have kind of like missed my my regimen because of the way that I'm smelling, right? It is something that happens to, I would argue, all of us when we are on HRT. So the idea that her testosterone and the things that come with it is just always going to be underlying is not really true for especially the type of trans woman that she's supposed to be in this film. In the film, Emilia also starts to fall in love with this woman who actually comes to her asking for help, and the two fall in love and have a close relationship, and it is kind of like this cute thing that happens within the film. Now, apparently in the original script, Emilia was supposed to have sex with a cis man, a man who did not know that she was transgender and couldn't tell because of the surgery that she's had. And Carla suggested that that wouldn't be the best scene for the movie because, well, your sexuality doesn't really change on HRT. You may end up becoming more confident about your attractions to people who you felt less likely to pursue when you were being seen as a man, but it doesn't change your sexuality. I mean, I've been on hormones for most of my life, and I still to this day have never looked at a woman and found her attractive in that way. It's just not something that really happens, really. Like, the people who say that it did were really just kind of coming to terms with the fact that they were attracted to people they didn't think that they were initially attracted to, frankly. So this idea that she would go from being someone who only slept with women and was like this hyper-masculine man who wasn't attracted to men at all to go sleep with a man is just nonsensical. But it is the way that a lot of cis hetero men imagine transgender women. That's the frustrating aspect of most trans representation that's done by cis people. Cis people tend to have a very minuscule, limited view of what the actual motivations of a transgender person actually are. You know, like at 34, there's very few things that I do in my life that are at all motivated by me being trans. Like very, very, very few things. In fact, I would say the only thing I probably do regularly that's motivated by me being trans is inject myself with estrogen. Like, that's it. Like, really everything else I have other motivations for. And it is kind of frustrating to me how frequently cis people just don't really want to seem to understand just how wide of a range of motivation transgender people can have. It's always about transition, gender, overcoming. And I guess I could argue that in some ways, Emelia Perez has like other things going on in her life than her just being trans, and maybe that's a good thing, right? But this film treats her transition as a story element as opposed to an actual reflection of who she is, I guess you could say, because it's very easy to say this person was unhappy and now they are, and that's something that you can demonstrate. It's another thing to genuinely understand the nuances and the layers of how someone who used to hate their body, who used to resent the fact that their biology was attacking them essentially, would feel in a new body. The reality is, when you transition, a lot of times you don't want to be even close to the person you used to be. A lot of people are trying to leave that behind. Not everything may change, right? But a lot of people who medically transition to this degree are not really walking around and feeling this like lingering regret for what used to be, because whatever used to be wasn't really what it could really be if they were honest, right? Like, If Emelia Perez is genuinely a transgender woman who medically transitioned, she's not going to, as some of the songs sort of suggest in this film, sit around and kind of resent the fact that she's not a man anymore and can't perform a masculine role within her relationships. In fact, one of the reasons why some transgender women I've known sort of date differently than they would have dated pre-transition, post-transition, is because it gives them more confidence. There are a lot of people who, for example, don't want to have sex with anyone until they've had bottom surgery. Because the way that they want to have sex, the way that they imagine having sex, is not one that includes that part of their body, right? And it's kind of a leap, I'm going to say, to go from being this like dog of a man to someone who would meet a man on the street and have sex with him without telling him. First of all, there's a lot of complications and complexities that come with being post-op. Like being post-op, I know this is going to be oversharing for some people, but a lot of times it does require that you communicate with your partner about it, even if your partner is into it, right? Because for some trans women, there are aspects of aftercare that should be thought of when you're having sex with a man like that, right? Now, for some trans women, sex with a man is the aftercare, but that's another conversation. Long story short, there are a lot of hurdles and things that come with a trans woman getting into her new body. And there's a lot of nuances that come with that I actually think would have been very, very interesting to pull from for this particular story. But it's clear to me that the director has sort of seen Emelia Perez not as a trans woman defining herself and standing on her own 2 feet, but as a man pretending to be a woman, right? And that's kind of reflected in a lot of the songs, a lot of the narratives that sort of come up. Like when she's developing her attraction to this woman that she ends up dating, there's a song about her being caught between worlds. And it's clear to me that this director could not imagine that trans women get into relationships with cis women. Like, true, someone who's gone through a transition, who's used to dating people as a certain gender, is going to have a bit of a learning curve when they're dating someone as another gender. But trans women date cis women all the time. I would actually say if you meet a transgender woman and she's open to dating cis women, she's more likely to be in a relationship with a cis woman than a cis man, right? Like, I honestly would say that. I would honestly say that it's a lot easier for a trans woman to be in a relationship with a cis woman. So it's interesting to me that in the director's own imagining of these types of relationships, he struggles to comprehend that a cis woman can want to be in a relationship with a trans woman, that a trans woman could want to be in a relationship with a cis woman without thinking of a man or herself as a man. Like there are just so many little layers of like interesting trans sapphic conversations that could happen there. But instead, most of this film is about the anxieties that men would typically have of their partners. Like Emilia gets to discover that her ex-wife was cheating on her. And of course, that is supposed to be undermining to Manitas, right? The soul that exists within her. Additionally, a transgender woman who lives with dysphoria is probably obsessively researching surgeons. I mean, that is kind of like what we do when we have access to the internet, right? We obsessively fixate on which surgeons we can go to, which ones for what kind of procedures we would get, right? Even me, I've never had plastic surgery. I've never done anything to myself like that, but I think about it a lot. And that's why I'm in the groups and I know the names and I know who's who and what's what, because that's just, I would argue, trans culture. There really is a short list that a lot of people go to. And I'll just say those names are not people in Israel. I mean, people go to Turkey for their nose job. They go to Brazil for their body. And they'll go to Thailand for their designer pussy. And all of these surgeries are had separately. They're not had in the way that it's shown in the film as like a one and done situation. Some transgender women will get multiple procedures done at once. But even then, a lot of times you have one surgery and it's really just the first of many. Surgery is often a long and lengthy process. It's not really suggested for people who haven't been on HRT for a really long time. It's suggested for most transgender women, especially if they want to get body work done, to be on hormones for over a year, because that's really when you start to see the changes happen. For example, if you are designated male at birth and you have a very, very flat chest, when you go in for breast augmentation, the likelihood of you getting a natural result is very, very low because you don't have breast tissue. But if you're on hormones for about a year, you will start to develop that breast tissue, and that breast tissue will give you a more aesthetically pleasing surgical result. I know that it's an intriguing plot device to suggest that transgender women transition quickly or transition overnight, but it's not really realistic. And that's another thing where I'm like, they could have played with this. They really could have done a lot with this story, but because it's through the cis lens, it's a very limited scope, and it doesn't quite entertain the larger, more interesting storylines that could have come with an understanding of who transgender people are. Also, when Rita does sit down and speak to the Israeli surgeon, he makes a point of essentially saying that you can change your body, but you're not going to change your soul. This is a really common, I would argue, transphobic talking point that comes up quite a bit to discourage transgender people from transitioning. And girl, I've been in the forums long enough to know that some of these surgeons are... So it's not like that's impossible, but it would be against their business to say that, right? It would be against their business really to sort of suggest that this trans person can't actually change who they are on the inside. And it's kind of hard for me to buy into the idea that someone can be both deeply dysphoric and also not know anything about these surgeons. But of course, that's a bit of disconnect that comes from the fact that this was not written to be a story about an actual trans person. It was a story to be written about a man pretending to be a trans person. And in a way, I kind of wish they kept it that way, because when you think about dysphoria and you think about this idea of this person actually being transgender, at least to me, as a trans person, it doesn't quite work. My estimation is that cis people have a very different experience with this film than trans people do. I think it's really great that Carla Sofia Garzón was able to give her input and make this film feel in its parts more authentic. But I do think that entertaining the idea of Emelia Perez as an actual dysphoric trans person would have probably required a complete rewrite, and the director really wasn't willing to do that. You know, he was willing to take little bits of input, but not really think about the entire film collectively. At least that's the impression I have, because this story still reads to me like a story about a man who has surgery and disguises himself as a woman, as opposed to a transgender woman who actually transitions because that is the way that she wants to live her life. And also, when it comes to her character development, I guess I was a little bit confused by that. In the film, she goes from being a violent cartel boss to working a philanthropic position where she finds the bodies of discarded people who came across the cartel. And I guess that's a change in a polar opposite kind of way, but we don't really understand why she would want to do that. I think that her role as a drug cartel boss has a tendency to fill in a lot of blanks that weren't really necessarily filled in the script. I think that we understand, maybe I'm alone, that many people are forced into that life, that there are plenty of people who exert extreme degrees of violence, not because they necessarily want to, but because they're seen as weaker for not doing that. And we really could have sort of seen that that was the case with Manitas before she transitioned to become Emilia. But honestly, I just didn't really feel like that was fleshed out as well as it could be. Because again, I don't think it was meant to be a film about an actual trans person. I think it was a film that was meant to be about a man masquerading as a woman and dealing with feelings of machismo as he watches the woman that he loves go and date another person and do all the things that he really wanted to do with her, right? Like, I think that's what this film is actually really about. This is a film about the anxieties of a heterosexual man. And at the end of the film, her machismo wins out. Her center as a man wins out. That is kind of the point being made. Transition was not really liberating to Emilia in this film. I mean, yes, she's able to sort of present herself in like this beautiful philanthropic way where she's, I guess, a good upstanding member of society, I suppose, but she doesn't really feel liberated by her transition. It's another hurdle for her. It made her leave her family, lose her hyper-masculine positioning in society as a patriarch, lose the respect and attraction of her wife, who she then has to go watch have sex with another man, who she could only respond to with violence. I can tell that there's a lot of people who would not pick up on a lot of the shit that I talked about in this video because they're not very intimately aware of transgender experiences. And I guess for me, it's kind of insulting that this is sort of being presented as like a good example of trans representation. I think it's great that it stars a trans woman. I think it's very, very cool that she's in it and that she has the awesome career that she's had. I mean, if you look her up, she is an out trans actress that has been in telenovelas and has been kicking ass and taking names for quite some time. But you know, for me personally, it just wasn't very good. And I honestly, I feel like I'm being gaslit by people who say that it's good. I was shocked to find out that Guillermo del Toro thought that it was an amazing film and is apparently friends with the director. I don't really know much about the director's previous work, or maybe I do and I just don't know that it's his, but I didn't think this was a good movie. I really didn't think it was a good movie. And I think it's really strange that people are telling me that it's a good movie. I genuinely feel like there's an agenda. There's an agenda out there that is trying to force this movie on me. And I'm just a good Christian woman with good Christian morals. I don't really believe in this sort of thing. So it's very strange to me that people are trying to tell me that this is a good movie. I really do feel like I'm being gaslit. I'm not joking. I thought that the music was pretty bad. Like pretty bad. There are some songs that I thought were pretty good. I thought that the love interest of Emelia Perez, not Selena, but the woman that she falls in love with, I thought that she had a great voice, and I really did enjoy some of the songs that she sings. I think she sings one at the very, very end of the movie where they're doing her funeral because, oh yeah, she dies. I don't know if I mentioned that she dies in this film. I thought that Selena was having a good time. You know, I didn't really think it was a very memorable role for her. I also thought that Zoe Saldana, her character was very forgettable by the end of the movie. They kind of like forget about her through the movie, if I'm being honest. It was really weird because at least from what I can tell, she's one of the bigger names attached to the project. So it's odd to me that she would be used the way that she was. And you know, maybe it's because I'm from California and I've known many a Chicano through my life, but I could tell that most of the cast wasn't Mexican. And when I found out that they filmed it in France and that even though all of these names are attached to it, most of them are not Mexican, it didn't really surprise me because it just didn't feel very Mexican to me. And really, when you think about it, the only reason this is a Mexican film is because of the Mexican drug cartel. Like, that's literally the only reason I could really think about this film needing to be in Mexico, because we could have a story about a criminal who changes their gender and, you know, all the things that happen, but it was the Mexican drug cartel angle that I think anchored it to Mexico. And it's odd because most of the cast not being Mexican is at least clear to me as a non-Mexican. It's gotta be even more clear to an actual Mexican. And I think the thing that also annoys me about that is that Manitas as a character really only gets so much establishment. Like, you really don't know too much about him other than the fact that he is a scary drug cartel boss who is a bit dirty and masculine, right? And I guess that's supposed to be juxtaposed against her transition. But I think if we just had a couple more scenes with Manitas, we would probably get some backstory from him that would, I guess, give us more of an understanding of why she is who she is. But really, again, like I said, this was a film that was supposed to just be about a, mean, weird criminal hiding himself through transition. That's really what it was supposed to be about. All the other shit that was added in by Carla, with all the understandings of Emilia actually being a trans person, I think didn't really necessarily add to it. To me, it really says something about people's taste if they saw this film and thought that it was a good film. I know that that's like a line in the sand, but I just found so many aspects of this film hard to get through that I'm shocked. I'm shocked by the celebration that the film is receiving. Like, obviously people worked hard on it. Obviously, I definitely think there were some cool things in terms of staging that happened in this film. I did sort of appreciate the fantasy aspect of the way that they filmed it, because it kind of is a stage show. They filmed the entire thing, I believe, on blue screen, on sound stages. So, there's interesting aspects to it there, but like, so much about it is just so underwhelming. And when we got to the end and I found out that like that's really what this was all about, like this entire film was really about just having that scene at the end where she says, "Oh, by the way, I'm your husband." And it was just so underwhelming. Emilia dies in a very underwhelming way. I mean, it all happens really quickly, and it just, I don't think was worth it. I do not think was worth it. So anyway, that is what I had to say about Emelia Perez. If you guys want to hear some more thoughts that I have about the controversy around Carla Sofia Gascon and her comments that she made on Twitter, I am going to be making a video on my main channel about that. If that video does end up going up by the time I upload this video, I will put it in the little video that's like right next to me over here. So go check that out. Anyway, on that note, I will talk to you guys later, and I want you to always remember and to never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye.